is a briefing that Anne has seen in various stages of its development. It's derived really, as you'll see, from a number of sources that we've developed over the years. But I want to tell you about it and why I think this really does warrant the time, the investment of energy and time that you are making tonight, by showing you a couple of pictures to make a point. Yeah. What's wrong with this picture? Anybody been in the TSA line lately? Oh, yeah. How many of those people do you think, or for that matter in your moments, hours spent going through this process, were even thinking about doing something criminal to an aircraft? Well, of course you weren't, and of course they aren't, and yet there they are. Some of them are treated rather badly. This obvious terrorist suspect was a case in point. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is the director of the FBI, who earlier this year declared to a gaggle of Muslim brothers that he had purged something on the order of 700 documents and 300 briefings from the files and materials used to train FBI agents in how to defeat what they call violent extremists. So this image is what I think is left of our counterterrorism capabilities as a result. This chap you may know from not so far from here, a perpetrator of what is now known as workplace violence. Workplace violence, when he killed, his countrymen and wounded a whole bunch more as a jihadist. We're not even prosecuting him at the federal level. This is well, we're in the military courts, but this is a case in point where the military's political correctness, which I'll talk about, is very much at work. This is a recent scene you may have caught.
Recently, yeah.
That's the flag that used to fly over the U.S. Embassy in Cairo being defiled and replaced by the black flag of Jihad. What's wrong with that picture? This was the next day in the Rose Garden, where the president got up and spoke at some length, actually quite misleadingly, about the attack that had taken place in Libya, involving the murder of 4 of our diplomats, including our ambassador. He never mentioned Egypt at all. In fact, it apologized to Mohammed Morsi and his friends for a film that he claimed was upsetting them all. How about this?
Yeah.
Just 2 days ago. At the UN General Assembly, the President of the United States said, and I quote, "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam." If that sounds a little familiar, it's because it is exactly what the Muslim Brotherhood, and by the way, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and Jamaat Islamiyah, and all these other cats are telling us we cannot do. No matter whether that might interfere with our First Amendment right to free expression. So, something's wrong with these pictures, right? And you probably have had some sense of this before I showed them to you. What is it? I'm going to propose that you cannot answer the question without connecting the proverbial dots. So I'm going to try to do that for you by introducing to you a couple of resources, one of which just went over there. But I'm going to talk about first this online video course, a curriculum, free of charge, that is in 10 parts and allows you to really take aboard what I'm going to treat you to in fairly short form here tonight. It connects the dots in 4 areas, and I'm going to go through them quickly. What is the threat? Well, these guys helped us write this book. A number of them. I know we've got somebody from Glenn Beck's team here. I want to salute and thank the Blaze TV for putting up last night and tonight a terrific video that draws on about half of these guys and gals. Among the best in the business. The book is called Sharia, The Threat to America. We have it available for sale outside. If you'd like, I'll sign it. It's also available online for free. If you want to just download it, shariathethreat.com. Newt Gingrich was kind enough to give us a plug. It focuses on this as the threat. What is Sharia? Sharia is literally the path. Some say the path to the watering hole. It's more than that. It certainly defines religious practices. Some have estimated that about 10% of Sharia actually has to do with how often you pray, which direction you pray, what you eat, what you don't eat, what you wash, what you don't wash. But it's also more, in the sense that it is truly comprehensive, utterly totalitarian, and certainly supremacist. And while there's that 10% patina of religiosity, it is mostly about political, military, and legal aspects of how the world must be governed, according to Allah. Brutally repressive, you see this all the time. This is an example of somebody being flogged for a petty crime, and that's relatively gentle. Amputation is something that is frequently applied for petty theft and the like. The law of the land in Saudi Arabia, where this photograph is taken. This is pretty grisly, but it makes a point. This is a picture that actually appeared on the cover of Time magazine. A woman who has had her nose severed by her husband, who was within his rights under Sharia to do that. Because women are chattel, after all, property. And that's actually not as bad as it gets. Enslavement, confined to the house, unless some male relative takes them out. No driving, needless to say, limited employment opportunities, and the occasional stoning on accusations often trumped up of adultery. And it just happens that women are particularly badly treated, but so are homosexuals, so are religious minorities, apostates. And frankly, it's not too good for anybody, to be perfectly honest, but particularly bad on those groups. But this is the point that we have to particularly connect the dots to. Namely, as you see in these photographs, and they were all over the place in the past 2 weeks, Sharia tells its adherents they will rule the world. And they must engage in jihad in order to bring that about. And most of really what I'm going to talk to you about from this point on is what that means. What jihad means and how it's practiced by those who adhere to Sharia. If I leave you with one thought, this is it.
That's right.
This is not about religion.
That's right.
This is really about power. If you get that, we can do something about
That's right.
this. If we persist at the insistence of the Islam that is prominent in certain circles, again, let me emphasize, not all Muslims adhere to Sharia. And I'm going to argue that the ones that don't aren't the problem. But the ones that do are, because they are pursuing a seditious program designed to destroy this country and rule the world. But because it is a political program, a seditious political program, we can do something about that. As opposed to religion, which we have to protect, right? Be tolerant of and respect. So, a further point on this is, you will sometimes hear people say, well, you know, Sharia is really whatever you want it to be, or it isn't something precise. And at the very same time, they will often say, it's certainly compatible with our Constitution. There are two possibilities with such individuals. They either don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Mostly.
or if they are in positions of influence, imams, leaders of Muslim American organizations and the like, you can bet they are lying to you. And there's actually a term for this practice. It's called taqiyya. Taqiyya literally translates into lying for the faith. And by the way, it is not simply something that you can do if it will advance the cause of the faith. You are obliged to do it under Sharia. And this makes things complicated, doesn't it? Because you have people, oftentimes very presentable people. People who speak good English, people who dress nicely, who don't have the beards and the skull caps and so on, who are telling you the sorts of things you really like to believe about their program. And if you don't know whether they're lying to you, it enormously exacerbates the difficulty of dealing with these things. So, these cats, about whom we've been hearing a lot lately, happen to be the prime movers behind the effort to bring Sharia worldwide. They happen to be the most proficient at lying about it, too. But let's get some of the facts down. These are the goals of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have been the goals since 1928, when it was founded in Egypt. They are unchanging. Bring Sharia into a dominant position worldwide and have a caliph rule according to it, a religious leader of sorts. Oh, that's interesting. Those are exactly the same goals as Al-Qaeda. And in fact, all of these other Islamist groups, many of whom, by the way, are splinters or former partners or otherwise members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so when these guys are described, the Muslim Brotherhood, are described as peaceable or non-violent, at least, or moderate Islamists, again, that is either a misunderstanding of what they are about, or it is the product of people lying about it. And let me just give you a reason why. Take my word for it. Here's the creed of the Muslim Brotherhood. Again, unchanged since 1928. Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, Jihad is our way. And dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound so peaceable and, tolerant to me, let alone moderate. And yet, can you believe it? The top intelligence officer of the United States government, a former three-star general by the name of James Clapper, now the Director of National Intelligence, actually testified before the House Intelligence Committee in February of last year that the Muslim Brotherhood was, quote, a largely secular organization that has eschewed violence, has now given itself over to good works, and has no overarching agenda, at least internationally, unquote. And the really scary thing, folks, is he wasn't just sort of making that up or talking about it off the top of his head. He was reading, it appears, from guidance that had been prepared for him beforehand. So I want you to hold that thought. It's another dot that we're going to connect. How could that possibly be? Okay? Well, we've talked a little bit about the threat of Sharia. I want to talk to you about the fact that this is not just a problem someplace else. This is here. Specifically, in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and its activities and organizations. How do we know that? Well, speaking of Providence, it's one of my favorite fun facts to know and tell. In 2004, a police officer guarding an important piece of infrastructure up in my neck of the woods, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. I don't know if anybody's been over it. It's a fabulous highway. Happened to observe, some might say he was profiling, but there happened to be a woman wearing a hijab who was driving back and forth across the bridge with some male driver. And he noticed that they were taking photographs, and you know, people familiar with this particular artery, you get up on top of this, you can see forever. It's spectacular. Some people take pictures, but this particular couple were taking photographs of the structural supports of the bridge. Alert as he was, he thought that probably was not a good sign. He pulled them over, he ran the IDs, and discovered that the driver was a fellow by the name of Ismail El Barassa, who was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago in connection with Hamas fundraising. That, fortuitously, gave rise to a search warrant, which the FBI executed on their home in Annandale, Virginia, which is about 25 minutes outside of town if the traffic's not too bad. Washington, D.C., that is. Well, they went top to bottom in this modest home. And then they discovered that below the bottom was a secret sub-basement, which had in it 80 banker boxes worth of the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. This document was one of the documents that they found there. It was a strategic plan. They formally called it the Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal of the group. This is the mission statement of that. Let me read it to you. The mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in America is, quote, a civilization jihadist process, a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, sabotaging its miserable house with their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated, and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Anyone still with Jim Clapper on the character of this operation? This is, to this day, the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. Not just here, but worldwide. It tracks with that creed. It tracks with the title of the document that is the source of the title of Glenn Beck's new film, The Project. A similar kind of global Muslim Brotherhood plan that was discovered in Switzerland in 2001, shortly after 9/11. Helpfully, these guys attached this document to that strategic plan. What is this document? Well, it has a list of 29 groups under the heading, Our Organizations and the Organizations of Our Friends. Imagine if they all march according to one plan. Now, this mission statement, by the way, and list and document was dated 1991. So that's 21 years ago. A lot has happened in the past 21 years, including, by the way, the proliferation of these kinds of groups. Hundreds of them now. But these 29 still represent, in many respects, the most important Muslim American organizations in the United States. Did you get that? I didn't say the most important Muslim Brotherhood organizations. I said the most important Muslim American organizations. In fact, if you turn on your television, the next time there is a terrorist, an incident of workplace violence, for example, you will invariably hear somebody from one of these groups or their successors, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, which didn't come into being until 1993. But there you have it. Don't take my word for it. The Muslim Brotherhood itself has declared these are their organizations and organizations of their friends. And not only that, folks, But right here, in River City, Dallas, Texas, when these documents were introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, not one, not two, not three, but 4 federal judges confirmed that when some of these guys tried to wriggle out of being listed as co-conspirators in that trial, the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history, they were properly identified as unindicted co-conspirators. So I suggest you can take this to the bank. These are the real deal. I'm not going to get into this unless you want to in Q&A, but suffice it to say, these are examples of the kinds of civilization jihad, the kind of, not so much non-violent jihad as pre-violent jihad that the Muslim Brotherhood and its friends are waging against our country as we speak. And in the course that I mentioned at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com, you'll see all of this elaborated on at length. Let me just mention something because it came up in that introduction to these legislators. And I know there are people in the room who have been working on this in Texas, and I know they want you to know that they're working on it, and I'm going to read Dory O'Brien's name because she is one of the leaders on this. Act for America, great organization, has been helping to counter this particular problem. You may not know. In fact, it's almost certain that you don't know that any of these sort of problems. Well, if you're in the Eagle Forum or Act for America, you know a lot more than the average bear. But let me just say, most Americans have no clue that Sharia is being insinuated in any of these institutions of our civil society, let alone into our courts. Now, frankly, I would have found it hard to believe myself had we not done a study back in July of last year at the Center for Security Policy. It's available online at ShariaInAmericanCourts.com. And this study took a look just at a tiny microcosm of American jurisprudence, which is, you know, a huge enterprise. 50 cases in which somebody was asking at the trial, rather the appellate level at state courts, to use Sharia to adjudicate a dispute, mostly in the family law area, as you might imagine. In 27 of those cases, in 23 different states, the court, at either the trial or the appellate level, agreed to use Sharia to resolve the dispute. The most egregious example of it, perhaps, to date, was one you may have heard of in New Jersey. It goes back to that image of the woman with the nose cut off. Fortunately, this particular woman did not have her nose cut off. She was just being tortured and raped systematically by her husband. The Moroccan woman, naturalized American citizen, came to the court asking for a protective order against her Muslim husband. And at the trial level, a judge ruled that he could not give her that relief because he could find no evidence of criminal intent on the part of the husband. He was just exercising his religious beliefs under Sharia. Now, fortunately, it was, as you would expect, overturned on appeal. But my point is, what the devil is it doing getting through even one level of our court system in America? And unfortunately, as those other cases suggest, and by the way, there are more, it's in our courts. So with the help of Act for America and others, in 4 states so far, a group called the American Public Policy Alliance has been trying to get legislation enacted that would, as one of your legislators mentioned, prevent not just Sharia, but any foreign law that violates our civil rights under the Constitution of the United States and or state policy from being used in the courts of this state. And I'm sorry to report that despite the heroic efforts of people in this room and others who aren't, it was almost enacted in the state of Texas. Wow. Until at the very, very last moment, it was taken off the agenda. And perhaps some of you in the room can explain what happened. I'm going to give you a theory of it in a moment. But I just wanted to introduce, in this case, as in all of these other areas, below the radar horizon, as they say in the military, we have seen this kind of stealthy jihad taking place, rotting out our institutions, eroding our rights. And you're not necessarily even going to notice it's happening unless you study up on this and begin educating others about it. So let me press on, because the last of those talks not so much about our civil society institutions, but our government. And that's what I want to dwell on for the remainder of my time with you. Because this is arguably the most serious of the problems that we're confronting. And I'll explain why in a moment. Because it's sort of topical, let me start with this guy and his administration. We've got 7 people that we've identified. There are more, but we've done dossiers on these 7. I'm just going to give you a very quick sense of what we know, only on the basis of what's in the public domain about these 7, and you make your own judgment as to whether this is a problem. This lady you may have heard a bit about. Homa Abedin, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State, has been with her for at least 12 years, going back to when she was the First Lady of the United States. Through the time when she was a senator, through the time when she was a candidate for president, now with her for the past 4 years in the Department of State. Homa Abedin's family is in a business established by a top Muslim brother by the name of Abdullah Omar Nassif, who happens also to be a top funder of Al-Qaeda. Now, when I first did the course, which came out in April, on the basis, again, just public documents, what I was able to establish was that her late father, her mother, and her brother were involved in that family business, known as the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs. Subsequently, and I'll come back to this in a moment, when this garnered a little bit of public attention, shall we say, we established that actually Homa herself had been involved in the family business for 12 years. Essentially, most of the time that she was working for Hillary Clinton, in fact. We know that because she was listed on the masthead of basically the only product of the organization, a journal of the same name. And for 7 of the years, by the way, also on that masthead was listed Abdullah Omar Nassif. Now, let me just read you this quote from the Washington Post in 2007. It's probably below your radar horizon, so let me tell you what it says. Quote, Abedin is one of Clinton's most trusted advisors on the Middle East. When Clinton hosts meetings on the region, Abedin's advice is always sought, unquote. Now this is a guess, but my suspicion is that if that's how she was being used in 2007, you can imagine how extensively her counsel is being sought now, given all the things that are happening in the Middle East. And what does it mean that somebody who is personally associated with the Muslim Brotherhood has that kind of role with one of the key policymakers in the United States government? A pregnant question, shall we say? Well, here she is. How about this cat? You may not have heard of him, Rashad Hussain. Rashad Hussain is, as they like to say, the president's special envoy to an organization you may or may not have ever heard of, called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. The second thing I hope you will take away from tonight, in addition to the point that Sharia is about power, not faith, is that you will remember this organization. It is to nation states what the Muslim Brotherhood is to sort of the subterranean operation. It is a mafia of 57 different nations or proto-nations. They call Palestine one for this purpose. In fact, anybody remember Barack Obama as a candidate saying he visited all 57 states?
Yes.
Wonder what that was about. Anyway, this guy has had extensive connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, including being a member of its initial organization, the Muslim Students Association. He represents us, nominally, to the organization that is now most aggressively pursuing this agenda of preventing us from slandering the Prophet of Islam and any other aspect of the faith. But I have to tell you, as this little quote down here indicates, that when the President announced his appointment to the OIC, he boasted that this guy would be very welcome in this community because he is a Hafiz of the Quran. Anybody know what that means?
Yeah.
Hafiz of the Quran is, as the President say, a respected member of the community because he's memorized every word of the book. Now, again, I may be overreaching here. I kind of think you're into it if you do that. And I don't just mean into the Quran, like, you know, let me see if I can do this. I think you're into the whole Sharia program because it confers this exalted status on you if you can actually do this. What does it mean that we've got a guy who is a Hafiz of the Quran, into it like that, and tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, guiding American policy towards the organization that is trying to squash our freedom of expression? And in so doing, by the way, I mean, I hope this is obvious to you, that would, of course, preclude this kind of presentation, keeping you witless about what they're doing, which is actually conducive, of course, to the stealthiness of the jihad. Moving right along, this lovely lady is an advisor to the President on Muslim affairs, working in the White House. Has her own ties to various Muslim Brotherhood operations. She has frequently been out apologizing or dissembling for them. But she also has as her day job working for the Gallup organization. And that's particularly helpful because, as you may have heard a little bit about lately, skewed polls. Well, you write the questions, or you skew the sample, or you just make it up, cook the books, and then you turn around and say, well, this is what Muslims think. She actually wrote a book about what 1 billion Muslims think. That, as Robert Spencer points out, among others, Stephen Emerson, you know, has in fact distorted what the sentiments or thinking of these folks is. What does it mean that a person with these characteristics is in the White House? How about this guy, a homeboy? Anybody know Muhammad El-Biari?
Yeah.
I know several of you talked with me about it before.
Yes.
Stories, Mike.
Muhammad El-Biari is based right here in Plano, where he created,
Colleyville.
back in 2002, the Freedom and Justice Foundation. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
That's the same name as the new political party of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Gee, that must be coincidental. Or maybe it's just because this guy is deeply tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, we have a briefing that he provided to this group, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, which is one of those apparatuses that the Muslim Brotherhood has created for the purposes of promoting clerical edicts to enforce Sharia. Which is particularly important if you go back to what I said earlier about many in the Muslim American community, particularly, and Muslims elsewhere around the world, not being as into this Sharia stuff as, say, Rashad Hussain or Muhammad El-Biari. Well, if you start imposing by religious edict or fatwa that conforming to it is mandatory, well, you can actually encourage or coerce people who might not otherwise be to go along with the program. This guy has a really interesting story, and I won't get into it with you unless you want me to in Q&A. Suffice it to say, did you remember that picture of the director of the FBI showing what's left of our counterterrorism capabilities? In no small measure, this is thanks to this guy.
Yep.
Because I think he engineered, the evidence is somewhat circumstantial, to be honest, but it's pretty compelling. He engineered the purge of those documents and the trainers, not only from the FBI, but from the Department of Homeland Security, where he serves on the advisory committee.
Oh, yeah.
Louis Gohmert, who many of you know, and I'll come back to in a moment, has raised hell about this, if I can use that expression, and rightly so. This is one of my personal favorites. Not as powerful or influential a figure as some of the others, but in the picture I'm about to show you, you'll see how extraordinary this is. Khifa Mustafa, like Ismail El Barassa, the guy who was driving on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and had all those documents down in his basement, sub-basement. Well, he was also doing fundraising for Hamas in Chicago. In fact, he was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. And yet, incredibly, the FBI selects him to be a participant in a 6-week outreach program to the Muslim American community and other citizens, of course, on the grounds that, you know, he's kind of a big deal in that community, which gave rise to this photograph. There it is. I don't know if you can make out the background, but that's the seal of the National Counterterrorism Center, which was on the tour that Khifa Mustafa was given by the FBI of a number of very sensitive facilities, including the FBI Training Academy and the FBI headquarters. This is arguably the most sensitive facility in the US government these days. And what's really interesting, you can't make him out, but tucked way back in here is this fellow by the name of Ben Bradley. I don't know if he's related to the famous editor of the Washington Post or not, but he was reporting for a television station in Chicago, and he was brought along on the ride. And he said, this is such a killer, he said, quote, Mustafa asked some of the most pointed questions during the 6-week FBI Citizens Academy and trip to Washington. And some of the most pointed questions, this is an intelligence collection operation. Period. He was very interested in knowing how we do counterterrorism, because it would be helpful to him in doing terrorism, or to his friends. Is that a problem?
Because it's political.
This is perhaps the most troubling of the bunch. Also, like Muhammad Ali Biari, on an influential Department of Homeland Security committee, this working group. His day job is the imam of one of the most radical mosques in the United States, happily also near our nation's capital, called the Al Dulles Area Muslim Society, or Adams Center. He's not only tied to the Muslim Brotherhood or doing business with the Muslim Brotherhood, he's the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States. Again, don't take my word for it. The first one on that list, introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, affirmed by 4 federal judges, was the Islamic Society of North America. And he's not only the guy that they put on this working group, which, by the way, promulgated the guidelines that told us that not only must all of those nasty, slanderous, reprehensible, outrageous, bigoted, on and on, Islamophobic documents have to be purged from the FBI's files. And by the way, the Department of Homeland Security. And by the way, the militaries. And by the way, the intelligence communities. But From now on, I'm not making this up, from now on, the Department of Homeland Security guidelines governing the use of any federal funds in the training in connection with countering violent extremism, and I should have mentioned that, by the way, is a euphemism for terrorism, which was the previous euphemism for jihad. But now on, any use of funds from the federal government for countering violent extremism, before they are expended, the agencies involved must consult with community leaders about both the content of the training material and the trainers. Well, who are the community leaders?
This guy.
They're Muhammad Majid and his friends. They're the guys on that list. They're the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you are of an age where you may remember, as I do, we used to fight another totalitarian ideology in the form of Soviet communism. Anybody remember them? Yeah. Soviet communism was so like these guys that somebody coined the phrase, and I think it's very apt. I haven't been able to figure out who it was, so I can't credit them, but I use it. This is just communism with a god.
Yeah.
But imagine, had we been forced during, say, the Reagan years, to ask the KGB whether it was okay to use somebody to train our people in countering the KGB, how the war would have worked out. I dare say not as it did. And this one is not going to work out so well either. Okay, I've taken a lot of your time and I'm not moving as fast as I thought it would. Oh, here's Muhammad Majid getting awards from the FBI.
For counterterrorism.
Is this a problem?
Yeah.
How about this cat? And I'll close with this. This is Louis Safi. Louis is featured in Glenn Beck's new show, as are several of these other guys. Louis was down at Fort Hood shortly after the massacre. Why was Louis Safi down at Fort Hood? Because he was involved in training U.S. forces in understanding about Islam and how to deal sensitively with the people that they were going to be going to war with shortly. Fortunately, a friend of mine blew the whistle on him and he was thrown out. But not until after he had been doing a lot of this training, and more to the point, after he had been doing a lot of selecting of Muslim chaplains for the United States military. Do you think that's a problem? If this guy is in fact extensively connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. He ran some of its largest organizations, including several of the ISNA operations. Well, not to worry, folks. Don't have him to kick around anymore. He's now poised to take over in Syria.
Yes.
When we finally bring the opposition to power.
Yes.
Instead of that beastly Bashar Assad. Well, that won't be perfect. Anyway, do you get the picture?
Yeah.
Okay, this is not an eye chart, and I won't bore you with going through it. This is a small sample of policies that have been adopted starting in 2009, going right up to the present, by an Obama administration that, as I have showed you, I think has been deeply penetrated by agents of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I would just suggest to you that to the extent that these policies come into alignment with the ambitions and goals or purposes of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not coincidental. It's by design. It is evidence of a civilization jihad that is working rather well. To their great credit, your own Louis, fabulous gal, Michelle Bachman, Trent Franks, Tom Rooney down in the corner, and Lynn Westmoreland, the National Security Five, as Newt Gingrich called them, took basically this course and other research that they obviously had access to, and they went to the inspectors general of these 5 agencies saying, What's up with this? Is it possible that the policies, and they enumerated some of them in each of the 5 departments, that you are promulgating could be being influenced by these Muslim Brotherhood associated individuals? And of course, as you know, she became basically the piñata for a prodigious attack by not only the Islamists, not only the Obama administration's friends and handlers, not only, of course, the media, but by John McCain and John Boehner, among others. So that wasn't perfect, but to their credit, they stood their ground. They've not backed away from the request. They've been stiffed by these 5 folks, but they are still adamantly convinced that we do have a problem. If you haven't seen it, I commend you a wonderful speech Michelle Bachmann gave at the Value Voters Summit about 2 weekends ago. And she also features brilliantly, as does Louis, in the Beck program, The Project. So this brings us to this cat, Mohammed Morsi, been, as you know, in our country this week, wined and dined, well, not wined, I guess, but dined at least in New York. For a time, it looked as though Obama was going to meet with him. Didn't have time for our friend Benjamin Netanyahu, mind you.
Did The View.
Did have time for The View, did have, it seemed, time for Morsi, but I think he figured out that this was probably not going to be a good photo op. In the immediate aftermath of that bit with sacking our embassy. And the rather pathetic response, as I've indicated, that he had. But that hasn't kept the president from looking the other way as the Muslim Brotherhood has consolidated power aggressively in Egypt, undermining Israel, including by bringing forces back into the Sinai in violation of the 1979 peace accords, actively resuming ties with Iran, and there's some evidence that includes seeking help from the Iranians to get an Egyptian nuclear weapon. How do you like them apples? Then there's this guy. Attractive figure. Anybody remember the old blind sheikh? Guy who tried to blow up the World Trade Center the first time and very nearly succeeded. And think about this. I'm told, and you may know the answer to this, I don't know the exact yardage, but I'm told that it was within feet of being placed. This is the Ryder truck packed with explosives from the structural support that, had it been blown, would have taken that first tower into the second and possibly killed as many as 50,000 people, because unlike on the early morning of 9/11, those buildings weren't thoroughly populated. At this occasion they were. Anyway, there's now talk of acceding to this guy's demand that we release this fellow. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've recently been treated to a report or two about what happens when these bad guys are let out of Guantanamo Bay, for example, that we're thinking now was responsible for killing our ambassador, or at least organizing the attack, was released from Gitmo. I'm sorry to say it wasn't by Barack Obama, it was by George W. Bush. This would make letting those kinds of terrorists look like you're taking them to Disney World. This guy isn't just putting gasoline on the fire. This is playing with nitroglycerin. Because he is a jihadist of the first order. Because he brings clerical authority to his orders that people engage in jihad. It not only resulted in, for example, that attack of 1993. I had Judge Michael Mukasey, you may remember, former Attorney General of the United States, and the judge who sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in American prisons, on a radio show this morning. And he went through a whole litany of attacks that this guy either ordered or was involved in conspiring to execute. including the murder of Anwar Sadat. And according to Osama bin Laden, issuing the fatwa that Osama bin Laden executed that did result in the destruction of the World Trade Center and a part of the Pentagon, and so on, as you know so well. This is a seriously dangerous man. And I couldn't agree more with something that Judge Mukasey wrote in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. He said, Congress should engage in ensuring that they understand exactly what's going on here. Because there's been a lot of dissembling about whether there's any plans or any conversations with anybody in responsible positions about doing this. As the judge says, these are, carefully crafted legalisms. But he goes on to say, he doesn't use the I word, but he goes on to say that if they proceed with this, the executive branch should be on notice that Congress will regard it as grounds for removal from office. Amen. Is that how you feel? That's how I feel these days. This guy is everywhere and way bigger than life. So let me just do one quick hit on him. You recognize him in his salad days, and you probably remember this guy. The man in the middle you may not know. Abdurrahman Alamoudi. Abdurrahman Alamoudi during the Clinton-Gore years was, as I note here, deemed so valuable an interlocutor that he was made a goodwill ambassador to the Muslim community. He was an advisor to the Arab-Israeli peace talks. And like Louis Safi, he was the original credentialer of chaplains for the United States military, and oh, by the way, for the U.S. prison system as well. Now, interestingly enough, when this picture was taken, the guy was one of the top Muslim brothers in the United States. He was not only running his own Muslim Brotherhood front, the American Muslim Council, he was on the board of directors of almost all of the rest of them, or otherwise associated with them. A preeminent figure in that community. Also, we subsequently learned, a top financier of Al-Qaeda in the United States. But this didn't come to light until, I think it was 2003, when he was apprehended coming through Heathrow Airport with $300,000 in cash that the late and unlamented Muammar Gaddafi gave him to fund a conspiracy to kill the then Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, now King Abdullah. He was tried and convicted of terrorism. Are you with me? This is not a good guy either.
This is just so complicated.
But I have to break some bad news to you.
Yeah, that's right.
Before he was prosecuted, about the time when this guy was running for president, he and his friends apparently calculated that they better hedge their bets. That while they had a good deal going with the Democrats, what happens if George Bush won instead of Al Gore? So they started doing something that might shock you. And it won't shock you if you think about it. If you think about what I said, that what we're dealing with are people who are very serious about the business of civilization jihad, who are absolutely determined to penetrate every one of our civil society institutions and governing institutions. For the purpose of what? Destroying us from within, by our hands. So in 1998, this guy went after that guy with the help of that guy. Does that face ring a bell? His name is Grover Norquist. Many of you in this room may know him, may revere him for his work on taxes. Certainly may regard him as one of the preeminent conservative movement leaders. And to be perfectly honest with you, I wouldn't necessarily have believed what I'm going to tell you about him myself if it hadn't been for another act of providence, which was that I sublet office space from this guy for 7 biblically long years. During which time I had an opportunity to watch what he was doing with this guy to help him and these guys. This look a little similar to what I showed you earlier. Get into bed with this guy. Initially in the campaign, subsequently after he was elected in the White House. This was a photograph taken in Austin at the governor's mansion in May of 2000, the middle of the campaign, Abdurrahman al-Amoudi. This is Khalid Safouri, al-Amoudi's right-hand man, who took over the Islamic Free Market Institute that Grover started with al-Amoudi. And here he is at the governor's mansion in that same setting with his friend and boss, al-Amoudi. This guy is prominently figured in the project and in our book and video. His name is Nihat Awad. Several of you resonated to the Council on American-Islamic Relations, one of the most aggressive Muslim Brotherhood fronts. He founded it. He still runs it as its executive director. Here he is with George W. Bush at the Islamic Society of Washington right after 9/11, when George W. Bush was importuned to come and show that he didn't have any problem with Muslims. He was surrounded literally by Muslim brothers. This is the guy I showed you a moment ago, Khalid Safouri. How about this guy? Anybody know him? Sami al-Arian?
Oh yeah, Florida.
Sami al-Arian, when this photograph was taken with George W. Bush on the campaign trail in Plant City, Florida in March of 2000, was running Palestinian Islamic Jihad out of his South Florida University professor's office. Sami al-Arian has blood on his hands and went to prison for his crimes. He's out, though. This guy is one of the most dangerous imams in the United States, Muazzam al-Siddiqui. Ran many of the top Muslim Brotherhood operations, including the Islamic Society of North America. Here you have him in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, presenting President Bush with a Quran, which prompted the president to say, Islam is a religion of peace. The teachings of the Quran are about peace and good. And so on. This fellow is Suhail Khan. Some of you who were active in Republican circles may have come across him. I was down in Houston talking to a group that the King Street Patriots put together for me, and I heard an interesting story from its founder, Catherine Engelbrecht, who I hope you know for what she's doing on True the Vote. Fabulous woman. She said Suhail Khan had come to her and said that if she were willing to make the King Street Patriots more inclusive, he could drive a lot of money their direction. That is a Muslim Brotherhood penetration and influence operation at work. And my question is this. I know these guys are working to get into a similar deal with the candidate today that they had with the candidate in 2000. And I think that is exceedingly dangerous. So let me just wrap this thing up. At the risk of having depressed all of you, more than anybody, let me just give you a little bit of hope. In this course, the Muslim Brotherhood in America.com, we dedicate an entire section, part 10, to what do we do about this. Given what I've shown, and believe me, this is really just, despite my falsely promising I would get through this very quickly, this is really a very superficial treatment of this very complicated problem. But there are things that we can do. Some of you are doing them right now. As individuals, and I hasten to say this, if there are any of those legislators still left, you may have noticed by that marvelous turnout that they are very interested in what you think right now. For at least the next 40 days, you have their rapt attention. Now, I'm not speaking ill of those, particularly those who've been kind enough to stay. But I am saying that a lot of others who are interested in your vote, or at least your money, or better yet both, will be very attentive if you will start telling them that you're concerned about this and you want to know whether they know anything about it or not. Because you can thereby, I believe, impel them to start getting smart about it as well. Which is the first step, of course, to them doing the sorts of things we want them to do, like the American Laws for American Courts legislation, that might actually help build some firewalls in our system against this kind of penetration. You can do stuff as individuals. It's a lot easier. There really is strength in numbers to do things with groups like Eagle Forum and with Act for America. We point out that if those don't scratch your itch, if you think you've got a particular niche that you specifically or you and your team could do something useful that isn't being done now, well, start your own organization. But I would just entreat you, before you do any of this, go to school on this problem. Take this course or study the books or read others, but you need to know what you're talking about. Because one thing you're going to find is when you get into the clinches with these Muslim brothers, they are very good at taqiyya. And they will use it to disarm you or to discredit you or at the very least to neutralize you. So you need to know, A, what you're talking about, and B, what they're talking about. So get at least together with these other groups and learn from their experiences. There have been a lot of false starts. I can tell you I've made most of the mistakes myself. There's lots to be learned by taking advantage of others who are in the business. And then there's stuff that we can do as a nation and must do. And I want to leave you with this thought because it's one of my favorites. Back in 1961, long before he became governor of California, let alone president of the United States, Ronald Reagan made a point which he subsequently made in slightly different ways repeatedly. And this is it. Freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. It's not passed on to our children through the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States when men were free. I propose to you that we fight our time's totalitarian ideology and not go down that road of trying to explain to our children why the country we were bequeathed is no more, and why the one that they're going to have to live in probably looks a lot more like Saudi Arabia than it does the United States where men were free. Thank you very much.